Do you ever find yourself just feeling blank and lost when you have to get started with a brand new code base? Well, in this week's episode, we'll reveal some awesome strategies to get you up and running with a new project fast.
Java Easy. News, tutorials, tips. Everything you need to know as a beginner Java developer.
Hey again, welcome back to the podcast. Okay, so I just want to offer you a quick gift before we get started. You might be completely new to Java, you're a complete beginner, and if you are, and you haven't yet grabbed our Java Beginner Starter Kit completely for free, then go over to our website at javaeasily.com and go grab it there. It's a super helpful guide designed for complete beginners, and it's going to get you up and running with Java in the shortest time possible. But anyway, on with the episode. So in this episode, we're talking about how to analyze a code base, and specifically how to get started when you start a new project, you're looking at a code base for the first time. What do? How do you get to grips with some code that you haven't seen before, that's completely alien to you? How do you get that into your head, get into the mindset of being able to get productive with that code base? And how do you get started basically when you start on a new project? So I guess to answer this question, we really, it depends from which angle we're starting out. So really, you've got to start with the end in mind first of all. And what I mean by that is basically you need to start any analysis session with really what the objective is of that session. So for example, it could be that you want to have, a full bird's eye view of how everything works completely from start to finish. It could be that kind of thing that you're after, that kind of level of understanding that you're after. It could be how just a piece of the system works, So it could be a very key area that you have to work on, that you've been given a task on. Maybe you're assigned to a new project, you've got a defect you have to fix, and you want to zone in to specifically just how one specific piece works. It might be a component, it might be a specific method in a class or whatever it might be. Or going a little bit broader from that, but still between the two of like having a complete bird's eye view and knowing everything, or just zooming down microscopically to this one tiny piece. It might be somewhere in the middle where you want to analyze how some of the key components integrate together and how those different components work together from a mechanistic point of view. And to be honest, your approach is probably going to vary depending upon which objective you have for that particular analysis session. So let's talk about the 100,000 foot view. If you want to get a 100,000 foot view of a system, how do you go about that from the outset? Well, there are a few strategies you can try. The first thing I always like to do is I want to find the main classes or the main class inside the application. And what we mean by that is that, as you know, in Java applications, it's always the main method, which is the thing that starts off any Java application, regardless of what type of application it is. Ultimately, there's always a main method there. And that's a method which has the usual method signature of, public static void main, and then it takes an array of string as an argument. So we want to find out really where that class is, first of all. And oftentimes you can find that quite easily in an IDE. So for example, in IntelliJ IDEA, if you create a run configuration or a debug configuration, when it asks you for the main class, there's always a section there. Once you've chosen what the class path is of the specific area that you're working on, it'll ask you for the main class. And then pretty much you can browse or type in the main class. And that's the class of the application which has that main method inside it. And in actual fact, it will even filter out only classes which actually have a main method there in the first place. So that's very useful. A kind of a quick tip, if you like, of being able to just find those classes inside the application which just have a main method and just go inside the edit configuration. So that's one thing. Now, once you've got this main method, it could be one of two different styles of main method, I would say. So in general, it's either going to be a main method in a non-Spring application. It's going to be a main method which contains the key classes, which are somehow going to start running to start the application or to do whatever it is the application needs to do. That's one style. In other words, this is kind of like a pure Java or core Java type project style. So yeah, you've just got this main method, and inside it, you've got some key objects or key classes in there which are being created and have their kind of like top level methods invoked to basically start the application running. That's one style. And the other style is going to be if it's a Spring application, or more specifically, if it's a Spring Boot application. Spring Boot is a lot more common now than plain vanilla Spring applications. And your mileage is going to vary and your approach is going to differ depending upon which type of project this is. So if it's a project which is just a core Java project, which just has a main method in there, then what you're going to do really is you're going to want to kind of go top down, if you like, from those method calls and be able to drill inside each method drill into each method. And you can do this very easily, by the way, with Alt, Command, and B. You'll also see, as well as to jump into implementation or view implementation or something, and that'll take you to the exact implementation of that method, which is also useful, by the way, if you're dealing with methods which are invoked against an interface, because then you don't have to just, when you click the link, normally it just takes you to the interface, which is kind of annoying. Instead, you can do Alt, Command, and B, and it'll jump to the actual implementation of that interface, or it'll give you a pop-up box which invites you to choose which particular implementation you want to jump to. But for the most part, you probably just have one implementation anyway. But anyway, so you're going to basically trace through the different calls down the application. So in a kind of a top-down view, so top-down from the point of view that we start with the high-level method, which is the main method. Then inside there, maybe there's an object which is created, which has another method invoked on it. So you're going to drill into that with this Alt-Command-B trick to go down to that, the implementation of that method. And then there you're going to see what that method comprises of. And again, you can do the same thing down. Again, doing this Alt-Command-B to be able to trace down, if you like, the flow of control, or the application flow, execution flow, whatever you want to call it, of how the application is actually running. You kind of, I guess, working in that respect, almost kind of like your own humanized version of the Java virtual machine, where you're doing a dry run, if you like, of the actual method calls which are going to be invoked, and trying to put that into context with your own technical knowledge of how you might see things playing out and that kind of thing. And just basically, you have to be a bit of a detective with this kind of thing, but that's kind of what you would do there. So that's kind of like a top-down approach of analyzing the code, okay, for a core Java project. Now, in a Spring Boot application, it's going to be different. You're going to adopt a different style of being able to investigate that project. And the reason for that is because all you'll find in the main method is basically, Spring application.run, and it's going to pass in the class which is annotated with @SpringBootApplication. And pretty much when it does that, that's just going to hand everything off to Spring, so that Spring's going to run everything. And so you can't adopt the approach we just suggested, where you do this top-down thing and you trace through the implementations with this Alt, Command, and B trick. You can't do that, because all you're going to see there in the main method in a Spring Boot application is a single line, or a few lines just basically invoking this Spring application run, passing in this class. So where do you go from there? Well, where you go from there is that you rely on the fact that you understand how a Spring application or how a Spring Boot application is constructed. And if you're familiar with Spring Boot applications, typically what happens is you end up with annotations which are placed on classes, which essentially are the components of the application. So for example, you're going to have @controller annotations, which adorn the Java classes which are being written to provide controller implementations. That is the presentation layer of a Java application, so to service incoming web requests. Okay, so those are annotated with @controller. You're going to look for @service annotations, or classes rather, which are annotated with @service, and those are the service implementations which are going to be delegated to from these controllers to do whatever business logic the application needs to do. Okay, those are the components, which are these so-called service components, which you'll find in a Spring application. And then you're going to look for example, @repository, or @JP repository, or whatever it might be, to look at the data layer. And in doing so, you're going to get a picture then of basically the different layers of the application. So, classes with @controller form the web presentation layer, classes with @service form the service layer for the business logic, and classes annotated with @repository typically form the data layer. And in doing this, you're then going to go in that direction of interpreting the application as a Spring Boot application. So for example, if you have controllers, which are there, then you're going to look at the declaration of the controller and say, okay, this controller here is defining these particular endpoints. That is URL paths that you can call or you can invoke HTTP requests against. And then you're going to trace through, what objects are passed in, what objects go back out, and that kind of stuff. And at that point then, you will be able to do this kind of, following the jump to implementation trick, which we said before. You can also look at other things as well inside Spring Boot applications. For example, look out for scheduled jobs, or scheduled jobs, however you want to pronounce it. Those are jobs that kick in basically on a kind of a cron schedule, or an automated schedule, which is normally defined in the application configuration. So the application.yaml file or application.properties. Again, that's also, by the way, a key place where you want to have a look inside your Java applications to understand what the configuration is and what's being configured. And then in turn, once you've looked at that application configuration and seen what properties are being configured, you can then search for those properties through the code base, find out on which classes they're used, and then kind of like piece things together from there. So it's always kind of like a detective style way of investigation, if you like. You might look as well for feign clients, for example. Feign clients are where you have REST API into other components as part of the service architecture. And you'll get to know these. The more you come to know about Java and the ecosystem and Spring Boot and everything, then you'll come to know these, and before long it'll be second nature to be able to find your way around these kind of code bases. You can also look to see if you can spot any patterns, any design patterns. Are there some kind of like design pattern naming conventions that you can see? Look out for words like factory, which are going to be the factory pattern for creating objects. Other words like, for example, decorator or observer, things like that. Those are useful to be able to, to have a look to see if you can see classes which have those naming conventions, to see if you can kind of, understand or interpret classes then as, these 3 classes here, for example, are part of this particular design pattern, that kind of thing. So all of those 3 things together, being able to have a kind of a top-down approach where you can to traverse through the implementation of the methods that have been invoked from the main method downwards, looking at the application configuration, looking for key annotations, looking at the application configuration and cross-referencing it back into a search against the code base. All of those things together formulate kind of like, a top-down kind of approach of how you can investigate a code base. Conversely, though, you can do something else, and you can actually, instead of going top-down, where you start from the kind of the entry point of the application or the outer parts of the application, if you like, and then go down into the details. That's kind of a top-down approach. Instead of that, you can do the opposite, and you can actually go bottom-up and go from some very, very deep part of the implementation, and then trying to work your way back up in a kind of a bottom-up kind of way. And to do this, you can oftentimes look at the tests, which are a good place to start. So for example, when a service method is called inside a test, so you're inside a JUnit test now, there's the system under test or the class under test, a service which has been declared. Ultimately, inside one of the test methods, you're going to have service dot, do whatever thing it needs to do, service dot, and then the method that you're actually testing or that's being tested, right? What you can do then is you can go to that method inside that specific test method and get a call hierarchy. And then what will happen there is it'll then show you the sequence of method calls that led up to that specific method call. And that's nice because that way it enables you then to work from the bottom up, because you can see, that particular service call being called, right? But then you see all of the other paths throughout the code base which has called that method or which can call that method. And that's nice because then you can start to take a step back and think, okay, so contextually now, I know that this particular service method is called from, say, these 4 different areas. And then, once again, we can go back to our top-down approach and then look at each one of these areas and then, see how that particular class or component or whatever it might be, how that fits into the overall schema of the application or the overall design of the application. So that's useful too as well. Now, other things that can help you analyze things, what I like to do is I like to document as I go. So I'll just have a Google Doc open and I'll just take screenshots of interesting things I see in the code base. Again, going back to call hierarchies, it might be call hierarchies, it might be type hierarchies, it could be snippets of configuration I find interesting, it could be search results I've done, which I found interesting as well. And there's no right or wrong of what you can collate into this document. It's just for you. It's not something you're ever going to release or something, although you can at some point. If it's useful, you can distill down that information and send it out to the team at some point, because that can be useful as well. If it's if it aids understanding and everything, it can become kind of like a design document or a design explanation document on its own. But really, the process of taking these screen grabs and trying to get these kind of like little gems of information, right, which you see during your investigation session, putting them into a document, it just helps you, it just helps you basically to grab all of the salient points, the points that you found salient rather, of the code base into one place. And then oftentimes you can then skim back through and then it sort of like recrystallizes in your brain exactly how the application functions, I find at least. It's also nice as well if you can write a quick explanation. Force yourself to write an explanation of what each component does, or components that you see, or key classes that you see, or key interactions that you see, or whatever it might be. If you can basically, write down the component name, or the 2 or 3 components which are involved in a particular interaction, and then write down a few sentences describing, or bullet points describing what actually happens or what the mechanism is for those 2 or 3 components to communicate with each other. Or, if you've got one particular component write 2 or 3, sentences describing what that component's really doing or who it interacts with and that kind of thing. That's useful because forcing yourself to paraphrase something which is inherently technical, right? And, sort of like splayed across several different areas. It's just technical stuff, right? It's just, code and code in different classes and methods here and there and configuration and everything. But forcing yourself to put it into, a very neat, concise couple of sentences or 2 or 3 bullet points forces you through that concision process, if you like, to really weed out and distill down the actual essence of what's happening. It's just basically that thought process, really something about it which really like pushes it into your brain of like, that's how things work, So that's something I do as well, which I find useful. You can also look at existing documentation. Documentation has a habit of going out of date pretty quickly, which is not ideal, but it's better than nothing, and it can give you at least some pointers of key classes you might want to look at. And also you can ask experienced developers for a bit of a KT or a knowledge transfer session as well, which is sometimes useful. Anyway, that's it for this podcast episode. We've covered a few different approaches you might take to be able to investigate existing code bases. I hope that was useful. Until next time though, happy coding and speak soon. Bye.